As we shift gears, this election season, Montana was front and center with one of the most expensive and closely watched Senate races in the nation. Diligently working behind the scenes to ensure a Republican victory was Montana's own Jason Thielman. With a Republican president and control over the Senate and the House, we're honored to hear from Jason on what happened and what's next. Please join me in welcoming Jason and Nancy, my co-hosts, to the stage.
Thanks, everybody, for welcoming us back. And Jason, thank you so much. It's such an honor to have you here with us at Business Days, and we're just thrilled to hear about your journey the last few years. And it's so amazing. Montana has really produced some highly qualified tactical experts. We have really good pollers. We had Jim Messina, who ran President Obama's campaign, and now we have you leading the Republican Senate majority effort. And so this is a really unique opportunity for us to hear firsthand national insights, and we really appreciate you being here. The other thing I want to say personally is Todd and I were speaking earlier about how anytime we've called you for anything, you pick up the phone, and that just is amazing for Montana. So thank you so much for always making Montana first, and can't appreciate that enough. Let's start by talking a little bit about your past and growing up here in Montana. You grew up partly in Chester, Montana, so a Highline boy, and the Flathead.
There's more people from Chester than in Chester, as you know.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about how that shaped you and prepared you for your professional journey.
My family homesteaded right outside of Chester, and we're implement dealers there. And like many families in the early 1980s, were hit very hard by the farm depression, and my family lost the family farm and lost the family business, and we moved on down the road to Whitefish, Montana. Probably the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. Sorry, Highline there, but Whitefish is a really nice place to. When I grew up, we have 2 stoplights and a McDonald's there. Is about as good as it got for an 8-year-old boy. But those experiences of seeing how horrible economic policies can impact families and the devastation to the main street of small town Montana is something that leaves a strong mark. I think all the more so when you're a very young person, seeing how the devastation of what happens as a result again of poor public policy and the long-lasting implications of that. And I think that's something that always was instilled with me with a passion of wanting to be involved and having a love and care for trying to really advance the interests and look out for small town Montana and small town America.
I can greatly appreciate that. As some of you may know, I'm from the metropolis of Ringling, Montana. And we have a sign in White Sulphur Springs that says 75 miles to the nearest McDonald's. And my family, too, was very hit by the extreme interest rates in the 1980s. So thank you for sharing that. And you now live close to D.C., and you have 3 beautiful children. How old are they?
I have a 14-year-old son, Alexander, an 11-year-old daughter, Abigail, a 6-year-old boy, Andrew, and as of this Christmas, a 7-week-old puppy, Newton.
Oh, nice. That'll keep you busier than the kids.
Yes, potty training, night and sleep training for 2 is not advisable, right?
Yes, and a lot of what we do as adults is for the future of our kids. Would you agree with that?
I think that's, as you first get involved in politics, that's not something you think about, as many of us here were involved from a very young age, but it continues to drive you more and more as you see those policies and see how things are impacting them, and realizing, where we live, I don't even want to send my kids to a public school. I don't trust what they'll teach them. I don't trust the values they want to instill, and that's tragic.
one of the things Jason and I were talking about earlier is how we were both babies when we started in this political world. And one of the first things that you did in your career in politics was run Bob Brown's campaign for governor.
Into the ground.
Yes. Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about, Carrie asked the question of you earlier, and how did that shape you in your approach to the political world?
There's some people who were older, wiser heads when I had that opportunity at a fairly young age to be Bob's chief of staff at the Secretary of State's office and then run his race. I thought I was a very smart, talented political operative until we lost. But I don't think there's any better experience than having an opportunity to be humbled at a young age, to really have instilled that you don't know as much as you think you know. And in that campaign, we ran against Brian Schweitzer, one of my least favorite human beings in the world, but somebody I would readily concede is easily the most, perhaps one of the most talented politicians I've ever come across subsequently, and I think a great person to lose to, because you learn so much from someone that was such a fantastic showman and he was good at the game.
All right, to start us off, congratulations on your recent success. Can you give us some background on what it takes for a senator to become chair of a party's majority effort? And so what goes into taking on this role, and exactly what is its purpose?
Well, I think typically the way a person is selected to be the head of the respective political committee for either the Republican caucus or the Democrat caucus is to be the person who shows up late at the caucus lunch and not realize what they're voting on. It is easily with the exception of the position of being the leader, respective leader of one of the two parties within the Senate. It's the most difficult, demanding, and thankless of the jobs that you could have, and the one that comes with the most profile aside from being the leader, and the most criticism aside from being the leader.
So as you took the role of the executive...
We wanted it.
Yes.
He didn't actually
Yes,
show
you
up
did.
last.
Yes,
Or
you
at least
did.
I wanted it. I don't know. I can't say actually Steve wanted to do the job, but I wanted him to do the job.
I agree. As you took the role of the executive director of Senator Daines for the Republican Senatorial Committee, can you talk about what that map looked like then, and what had to happen for the change?
Absolutely, and I'll roll back just a little bit right before we walked in, when Steve made the decision to run for chair of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. He and I were, having dinner. We had, won a great and tremendous victory in 2020. Spencer was a great part of that effort here in the front as executive director at the party at the time. Many other people played an important role in that success. But it's kind of a letdown after that. Like, well, now what are we going to do that's interesting and exciting and motivating? And we're having this conversation about highest and best use. And we talked about, well, we're pretty good at winning tough races. Maybe we should expand upon that in another meaningful way. And I started outlining just what the map looked like for 2026, or excuse me, for 2024. And it was a situation where we had twice as many Democrats up for election as Republicans. And importantly, we had these three Democrat senators in Republican states, Montana, West Virginia, and Ohio, that we had failed for 18 years to win, despite the fact that these were states that had Republican supermajorities in the state legislature. All the other constitutionally elected office holders were Republican, and the only thing that looked different than the other was this one Democrat senator. And that really intrigued Steve as he thought about this unique moment and opportunity that needed to be executed upon correctly. And I got back and I got into the office after dinner the next morning, and he had, mapped out all these other things. And he said, there's another thing you haven't thought about or pointed out, Jason, is when you look at what the Senate map looks like for Republicans to pick up and gain seats in 2026, there are no Democrat Senate seats held seats in 2026 that look anything like these seats in 2024. So a very limited opportunity to pick up a seat if we fail to gain the majority in 2024. And he said if you even look further over the horizon in 2028, there again are 0 situated seats for us an opportunity to pick up. So if we don't gain the majority in 2024, there's a very strong prospect that we remain in the minority in the United States Senate through the end of the decade. And especially at that point in time, prospects for us winning the White House were especially dim, and we had just gotten through the whole speaker fight, so it was an absolute given amongst most that it was unlikely we could hold the House. So the best opportunity for the Republicans to hold any of the levers of power in Washington, D.C. was the United States Senate. And if we failed to do that, the Democrats appeared likely at that point in time to have the White House and the House. And with a U.S. Senate that no longer had potentially no longer a Joe Manchin in West Virginia or a Kristen Sinema in Arizona, you'd have a Democrat majority that was open to the most extreme propositions that the Democrats wanted to put forward, namely making Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. a state, creating a permanent infrastructure of Democrat power in the U.S. Senate, eliminating the filibuster, packing the Supreme Court, and passing H.R. 1 to permanently rewrite our election laws to give them yet another permanent advantage. So as we looked at those consequences and looked at that unique opportunity in the moment and how important it wasn't to fail, that was what weighed on us as we walked into the building, that we absolutely had to succeed at this mission. There really may not be another moment if we failed to stick the landing in 2024, and the damage that would be done to the Republic would be irreparable, and there would not be really any coming back from it with that domino effect of events if Democrats pulled off the trifecta.
So can you talk a little more about what that map looked like? There were obviously states that favored both parties, and there were states that you wanted to focus on. What did that look like?
Well, everything first began with the importance of focusing on these three red states, these 3 opportunities that Republicans had spent nearly $750 million trying to win over the last 18 years and failed. So that was where the initial focus was initiated. But then you move to the next tier of opportunities and states, the places that we knew would be battleground swing states, but difficult to win: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona. And that was then the next set of the focus. And we looked at the failures of 2022, and what really stuck out was just the tremendous expense and damage that came as a result of these very contentious Republican primaries, of sort of the McConnell wing of the party being on one side, the Trump wing of the party being on the other side, and they spent $315 million, beating one another up in Senate Republican primaries in 2022. And there was no path, given the narrow opportunity for success, especially in that next tier of states, unless we could find a way to avoid what happened, especially between Dr. Oz and Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania in 2022, that cost us any opportunity to win that Senate seat, what otherwise should have been a winnable seat, given we were running against somebody who couldn't button his pants or spoon applesauce into his mouth.
So you all chose to focus on 3 races, really.
That was the start, and then we
Yep.
built.
Yep,
Then we
and then
built
you
from
built
that.
out.
But the first key
Yep.
was to get those 3 races, which was we walked in was appearing to be a very difficult scenario. In Montana, we were on the cusp of kind of a repeat of the challenges that we had with 2018, with kind of a rematch of that race. We were looking at a rematch of our race in 2018 in West Virginia, where Joe Manchin was elected as a result of a horrible Republican primary with, frankly, the same candidate looking at running again for the Senate there. And then in Ohio, certainly a bloodletting, and with the type of candidates considering running that would have a repeat of our failed effort in 2018 as well. So trying to find a way to circle the wagons and clean up that situation was job number 1, and then we began to move down the list, identifying how we could expand the map and move these other races that no one thought were remotely seriously in contention to make those toss-up competitive battleground Senate seats.
And part of this equation is a Trump nomination. How did this play into and fit into your map?
What was very clear after the conclusion of the 2022, and to some I think probably clear prior to that, there is no more powerful presence within the Republican Party than the complete and total endorsement of President Trump. And if you wanted to make any sort of effort to unifying the party, you needed to first make certain that you started with understanding that basic reality first. Now, the senator and the president had a very strong and mutually respectful relationship of one another going into that process, and we focused first on where could we build consensus with candidates that the president could get behind.
And is it safe to assume that this whole map may have looked different if there was a different presidential nominee, or would it have been the same plan?
I think much of the plan, certainly starting with the first three states, I think would be the same, because I think regardless of who our nominee was going to be, Montana, West Virginia, and Ohio were going to vote strongly for the Republican candidate for president. And I had this conversation with many of the candidates that we were working to recruit across the board. Many of them were uncertain what it might be like to run with Trump on top of the ticket and what implications that would have on a down ballot race. The standard perception for most of that point in time was something that would make success difficult. It was our basic contention that was a misunderstanding and a misread of what kind of electorate we were facing and where the mood of the country would be, because we are increasingly now a multicultural working class party, and where once the basis of Republican turnout and success was more with the professional college educated classes that are high propensity voters, were our increasing opportunity for success, and voting groups that we overperform the greatest with are lower propensity working class voters. And you can have the best, most effective, heavily invested turnout program you could hope for, but there is nothing that really replaces the motivation for those folks to turn out like President Trump. And that was, I think made it easier, candidly, to win those three, especially those three states, than it would have been, say, it had been Nikki Haley.
So one of the things that I think is a constant in my experience in politics is that the pendulum swings. It swings back and forth, and earlier today we talked about the realignment of politics and how that really involves the importance of the working class, and more importantly, the multiracial working class. And can you talk a little bit about that and the importance of that played?
Absolutely. Does anybody here know what the most reliably Republican state in America was at the beginning of the 20th century? Anyone want to take a guess? Vermont. Close. Maine. Right? What was the most reliably Democrat state in America at that same point in time? Close. South Carolina. Right? So these realignments do happen, and it dramatically changes what the makeup and what the opportunities and what the permutations of math will be of how you approach this. But there are some remarkable stats when you look at both the 2016 victory of President Trump and how he grew that into 2020. But prior to 2016, the folks in the bottom 20% of income earners in America were one of the strongest Democrat voting blocs. Republicans lost them consistently by double digits or more, and we traditionally won by the greatest margin, those in the top 20% of income earners. In 2016, we didn't quite win the bottom 20%, but you saw it narrow dramatically on both sides of that equation. And that was primarily driven at the time by non-college educated working white voters, which actually are much larger. People I think underappreciate how large that voting bloc is. It's still the single largest voting bloc in America, but has one of the lowest voter turnouts of any of the traditional voting blocs. And that is what fueled Trump's victory in 2016. If you fast forward to 2024, what you saw were the most dramatic gains for Republicans were amongst non-college educated African Americans, non-college educated Hispanics, and especially young men. And the movement amongst those groups is dramatic, but it makes it makes a great deal of sense when you give thought to where the focus of the Democrat Party is. And you've all seen, and I shared this earlier when we were visiting this morning, the signs. In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter. We believe this litany of cultural issues. Regardless of what you may feel about that, but if you've ever seen those signs, and if you're in Helen or Missoula or Bozeman, I'm positive you have. Ringling, probably not so much.
We do.
But nothing on there talks about the working class. And if you go from 1960 to 2016, and you ask people, why did you vote for the Democrat Party? Well, the number one reason people voted for the Democrat Party is they felt they best represented working class voters. You ask people why they're voting for the Democrat Party today, what the number one reason is they best represent marginalized groups. Second is climate change. And third is they are best to represent working class voters. So we have really flipped what the perceived priorities of the parties are, and as a result, regardless of race or ethnicity, if you are a working class voter, you increasingly see the party that is best representing your concerns and the interests of your family to be the Republican Party, which I think is a good thing, by the way.
So let's go back a little bit and talk about candidate recruitment. You and Senator Daines took a very different approach on how to do this in the primary battles. Can you talk about how this approach differed from your predecessors and how you evaluated some of the candidates?
There have been changes in philosophy, certainly by the national committees and the approach with how to be robust. But typically, the approach has been, the national committees are incumbent protection organizations, so they'll be robustly involved in any sort of primary situation for an incumbent, but very laissez-faire and hands-off in a situation where you're in an open or challenger race. And as I referenced earlier, when we looked at the fact there was $315 million spent in 2022 in Republican Senate primaries, whereas Democrats spent $120 million on these same primaries. And you looked further that the Republicans would have won most of the targeted seats and opportunities in 2022 for Senate races if only our Republican candidates for the Senate had garnered as many votes as our Republican candidates for Congress received in those same states. It was clear that we had a dramatic impact as a result of that bloodletting that made it difficult for us to succeed where we couldn't. So if we were going to restore donor confidence, if we were going to recruit good candidates, we had to give people confidence that there would be a strong effort to support them. When we were talking to Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania, it's like, why in the world am I going to sign up for this if you're going to do nothing if Doug Mastriano, who had the greatest electoral defeat in Pennsylvania history as a Republican candidate for governor and cost us both House seats and was a negative drag on the Senate race. If you're going to do nothing about that situation, I'm going to be entirely on my own until the day after the primary, why am I going to set myself up for what is already going to be a difficult situation, and you're now making it likely an impossible situation? We sat down with Governor Jim Justice in West Virginia. It's like, I'm not going to run unless I know I have your complete, total backing and support. Otherwise, I'm going to be spending a ton of money and effort, in this horrible primary fight. So it became very clear, both from a donor frustration and angst with the type of people who were emerging from these races who they felt were fundamentally flawed and unable to be successful, as well as the chicken and the egg portion of how are we going to get very strong, capable candidates in the race unless we took a robust approach from the beginning. We were going to be doomed to failure in repeating the exact same outcome that had happened both when we had this same cycle in 2018 and when we had this same cycle in 2012 and when we had the same cycle in 2006. So it was really born out of the fact that it was necessary, and then also referencing, as we decided to take on this mission, understanding that there was not an opportunity to make up for failure, that we simply couldn't screw this up, or there might not be any coming back from it. So we just had to do what we had to do. I would say the other piece of this is it wasn't just the recruitment, it was the disrecruitment of candidates that was critical. And actually we had 8 battlegrounds, and then we also had a late opportunity and added, Maryland as a competitive race that Democrats really had to focus on. In those 9 races, we only had one of those Senate races that had any sort of competitive primary. We spent $65 million in Republican Senate primaries in 2024 versus the $315 million that was spent in 2022. Democrats actually spent $127 million in their primaries, twice as much as Republicans. The first time, that has happened in at least 24 years, where they spent significantly more in their own inter-party fights than we spent on ours.
I'm really curious about this new approach because I do think that there's a lot of people that hesitate to put their hat in the ring because they do not want to get beat up in a primary. So that's really fascinating.
And to say, primaries aren't fundamentally, where we cared about a primary situation as well, right? In Ohio, we took a little bit less robust of approach. There were certain people who could have gotten in the Ohio Senate race that would have created a scenario would have been very difficult, potentially very difficult to win. But we had 3 quality candidates. So while we did get involved, some with the president towards the end with Bernie Moreno, we felt much more comfortable having a more hands-off approach, and I think the primary, served a useful, in many ways, served a useful purpose of making candidates stronger. But you need to make sure that you feel confident that the result of that situation isn't going to position you for certain failure. And in certain places, like Dave McCormick, again, for example, you weren't going to get him in the race unless you agreed to take an aggressive approach.
Let's follow up a little bit with that on President Trump and his involvement with the process. How involved was he?
He's the leader of the party, although going backwards to February of 2023 when Steve and I first went down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with the president and talk about his new role as chairman of the NRSC and some of the priority races and how we wanted to work with him, it was far less clear that he would be in the dominant position he ultimately was at that point in time. In many key state polls, he was even trailing DeSantis, and when people looked at the challenges he had ahead, it was far from an even money bet that he would even necessarily be our nominee. But regardless of that, it was very clear that his involvement in these races in 2022 were very determinative in the outcome. J.D. Vance in Ohio was, barely in double digits, 4 weeks, 5 weeks out from the primary election in 2022. He didn't have much money left in his campaign account. The large outside expenditure effort that had been working on his behalf was out of money. The Trump endorsement immediately moved him to first. There was no doubt Dr. Oz was on his way to losing as well if Trump hadn't endorsed him. Same situation with Blake Masters in Arizona. So it was just very obvious that if he were to weigh in and engage in one of these primaries, and we had invested all this time and effort, whatever work, whatever effort was done would be undone if we found ourselves in an opposite situation as the one that we are in with him. And that was also, Steve was always going to support President Trump. He's been a long and loyal supporter of the president. But initially, we weren't sure if in his role in the National Committee, and especially with where a lot of the major donors were, if it was appropriate for him to make an endorsement as a member of Senate leadership. But part of the consideration was we simply needed to have that strong relationship, and Steve was the first member of Senate leadership to endorse the president, which at that point in time wasn't very popular. Both of us spent our entire day with people calling on the phone, yelling and screaming at us, furious with the decision that he had made at that point in time to back the president.
So that was one of the surprises. What other surprises did you experience in the campaign process and that you weren't expecting?
I think there were a couple things. First, we had some of our initial meetings with the president, and it seemed certain he was comfortable with where we wanted to go with a campaign or a candidate. But as it is with the president, and this is both a feature and a bug, I suppose, but there's a lot of access to President Trump in a way that traditionally doesn't exist with presidents, and that means there's also a lot of voices. So when you think something is done, it's usually not exactly actually done. So you need to continue the process and try to triangulate who are all the folks that are working kind of counter to what you thought was already agreed upon in the direction that you would go. And again, in kind of traditional politics, right, in political figures, and this is both, again, probably a feature and a bug. I view a lot of good to this, although it can be exasperating when you're trying to get a certain outcome agreed to and move forward on something. It isn't always obvious who those people are, right? If somebody wants to, if somebody isn't visiting directly with Senator Daines, right, about a policy matter, but they're visiting with me, is no longer his chief of staff, but during my time with him as chief of staff, and I told you, yes, he can co-sponsor that bill. It's good. We're good. We move forward. That's a done deal, right? That's not how it works in that set of circumstances. So you need to kind of always constantly be reinforcing that. The other really sort of interesting aspect of all of that was understanding better in the Republican ecosystem. There are basically 3 billionaires that fund Republican Senate primaries. So they carry a great deal of influence in the process. So, and they're not really accessible individuals per se. So just like you had to have a strategy around figuring out how you're going to align with the president, these 3 billionaires didn't always align with the president. They certainly didn't always align with Mitch McConnell either. You had to, maybe just 5 of them, but there's a handful of these key individuals as well that you need to determine how you could make them comfortable and bring these 3 sides together. And at the beginning, right, the Club for Growth hated President Trump. President Trump hated the Club for Growth. That's all been mended. Mitch McConnell didn't like President Trump. President Trump really hated Mitch McConnell. And you had to find somehow or another where is the happy place that all 3 of these lines can cross. And the best way to make sure someone didn't agree with you on anything was if the president knew the Club for Growth liked somebody, he immediately hated them, and if Mitch McConnell liked somebody, the president immediately hated him, and vice versa, right? So that was an interesting puzzle to figure out how you put that together.
Sounds like a chessboard. All right, so maybe my last question, then we'll open it up to the audience for a couple of questions. And What would you say are the top priorities now for the Senate?
Right, it's tax policy and immigration policy, right? Those are the twin pillars of the president's agenda and priority, and what he was elected on, and what I believe our Republican majority that we kept in the House was elected on, and certainly our Republican majority in the Senate.
Thank you, Jason. Does anybody in our audience have a question? Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't get a call.
No, you're good. You're good. You're good.
I just wonder nationally.
Let's get you a microphone. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm just wondering nationally, did you see any movement in the election similar to what we saw change here in Montana? We're winning more Republicans that are tribal members, that are union members. It seems like low-hanging fruit when you start talking about the conservative values. Did you see that nationally?
Absolutely, right? So African American, I might have these numbers slightly, I might be misrecollecting them slightly, but I believe the movement, the improvement of Republican performance amongst African American voters, right, was I think 29%. The movement among Hispanic voters was a little over 20%, and the movement among Native American and other minority groups was approximately 17%. So we did see some loss in further erosion in college-educated white voters, but you saw massive gains across all these various other groups. And in fact, if you were to look at the difference of white and non-white voters in this most recent election cycle, it was the narrowest it's been since the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Yes.
Or maybe did I answer your question?
Well, yes, you did. I didn't ask the question very well. But
I was going to answer the one I wanted to anyways.
did you have a strategy to actually go into those communities? Was that intentional?
Yes, no, absolutely, that was strategy. Although, candidly, right, much of that was led on the presidential level, which is one of the reasons, I would take issue with those who said that Nikki Haley would have been a better nominee for the party. I think President Trump was uniquely positioned to be able to reach out and grab the attention and the support of this coalition that, frankly, a traditional sort of Bush Republican was not going to succeed in doing.
Thanks, Jason. Any more questions? All right, Dan.
Yeah. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Dan.
I think, President Trump swept the swing states, and I think the NRC certainly overperformed, but there were some areas where Republicans fell short in Senate races where Trump won on the top of the ticket. So just wondering your thoughts on sort of what those were, and I was thinking like direct spend, third parties, et cetera, where you were just facing some structural issues and swimming upstream a little bit compared to the president.
The one state where we had near parity in spending amongst the 5 presidential swing states that also overlap with the Senate races was Pennsylvania, which oddly enough is the one of those races that we succeeded in. If you look at the difference in performance between the top of the ticket, right, in the down ballot Senate races, the difference when we had incumbent candidates up who are going to tend to have less of a drop-off in vote, less of an undervote, or bleed to third parties in 2020 between where the president was, right, and where the Republican candidate for Senate was 1.6%. I think it was 1.7% in this most recent election cycle. So we always knew there would be a drop-off and a slight underperformance with our Senate candidates. However, if you were to go back to 2000, we had the second lowest occurrence of undervote, meaning those that cast a ballot on the presidential level but didn't cast a ballot in Senate races. But nonetheless, right, in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, where Trump's victory was a little bit less than what it was in Pennsylvania, I think about 0.4 of a percentage point less, that was the difference in the ability to bring our Senate candidates across. And then also in Wisconsin, the Democrats had two third-party candidates with, running under party labels that they had recruited, like America, America First and so forth, which just bled a little bit on the third party side. But fundamentally, the greatest challenge was money. Democrats had a massive financial advantage, and one of the most important windows, and we kind of put out an SOS memo right after Labor Day to the donor community and try to make a big deal out of that nationally, that if we didn't get a significant infusion of $30 to $40 million over the next few weeks in September, we were going to be in a position where our candidates just wouldn't be able to properly define themselves, and we would lose some of these potentially winnable races.
All right, we have time for one last question. Adam.
Yeah, Jason, I wonder, the president wins nationally by 2%. We win the majority, we get the battleground states, and the House is razor thin. What's changed in the redistricting, and what does that implication look like as we go forward, where traditionally, if you win the popular vote nationally, the House should follow. So what's different now?
A couple further observations on that. First, this most recent cycle was the first cycle since 2008 where Republicans won the presidency, won seats in the Senate, but lost seats in the House. We lost 13 House districts that President Trump won. Now, I think there are a couple factors that come into play. One certainly is the more aggressive posture that we took at the NRSC to better shape these playing fields. The second, and this is really boring sort of legalese, but Montana was actually the test case for this. We put in place a new legal funding framework that allowed us to use a significant number of dollars that were raised in the committee in conjunction with candidates to be able to spend at the candidate rate. The NRCC did not agree with our legal strategy, and they funneled about $40–50 million instead in these final few weeks through their traditional independent expenditure unit. Now, the implications of that, let's just take here in Montana, where we kind of did the initial test case. Tester and his lawyers actually sued us on this and lost, but in the Missoula media market, it cost 15 times as much in the month of October for an independent expenditure unit or a super PAC to buy a television ad as it did for the candidate or for the new legal structure that we put forward and used to drive all of our dollars that we had to spend in the month of October. I think that was a significant mistake on the, by our sister committee. And if they had taken I understand why they didn't. It was a high-risk strategy, right? I could be in jail or at the very least publicly humiliated had it gone the other way. But it worked out, and had they taken the same risk, I'm confident we would have had. When you look at the margin of loss in 2 or 3 or 4 of these House seats, they would have a slightly more robust majority.
Gosh, thanks, Jason, for taking the time to be with us today. Is there any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our group?
Well, again, I'd just like to reiterate my great appreciation for the opportunity to come back home and just spend some time with Montanans. My heart just leaps the second I get off the plane and take my first breath of air. But so many wonderful friends and supporters here of the senators and our effort, and we're just so extremely grateful to the folks in this room that have been such an important part of the mission that we've had to paint Montana red, elect Senator Tim Sheehy, and make Montana great again. So,
thank you so much.